The second hand made its rounds with a sound that was too small to justify how loud it felt. Somewhere nearby, a metal latch clicked, tested, then clicked again, as if the first click hadn't counted. A chair leg scraped a fraction of an inch and stopped. Cloth shifted. A breath was released carefully like it might disturb something. There was a smell of oil and damp paper, and underneath that the faint, tired warmth of bodies that had been sitting too long. A thin draft moved through the room in pulses, not steady enough to call wind. It lifted the corner of a page and let it fall again. It touched the back of a neck and left. It returned. On the table, a pencil rolled until it met the edge of a ruler and settled there. A hand reached for it. Not to write, just to stop it. Fingers pinched it between thumb and forefinger, held it for a second, then set it down in the same place, aligned more precisely than before. There were habits here, practiced into ritual. A mug was lifted, brought to lips, lowered without a sip. A sleeve was tugged at the cuff, then smoothed, then tugged again, each motion identical, as if repetition could keep the air from changing. Someone tapped a nail against glass 3 times, paused, then 3 times again. Quiet signals. Private metronomes. In the corner, a machine exhaled softly and continued its slow work. A steady mechanical whisper that suggested order even when nothing moved forward. The sound didn't change, but the room listened to it anyway, as if it might. A page was turned, but no one spoke. The turn was too gentle, almost polite. The paper gave a small complaint and then lay flat. Another page waited beneath it like a held breath. There was a clock on a wall that didn't quite sit straight. Every time the second hand passed the top, it caught the light for an instant and flashed. Flash, flash, flash. The kind of thing a person could watch for minutes without meaning to. The kind of thing that made waiting feel like a task. A door somewhere farther down, 2 corridors away or maybe 3, opened and closed. Footsteps approached, slowed, then receded, as if whoever had been coming decided against it. The last step lingered, a heel on stone, then disappeared. A voice muffled behind a partition tried a sentence and abandoned it halfway through. It became a cough. The cough became silence. The silence returned to its place like a sheet pulled smooth. Someone's fingers drummed once on the tabletop and stopped immediately. Guilty. Another hand slid across a stack of papers, squaring them, then squaring them again, making edges line up with a precision that felt desperate. A watch was checked. The wrist lowered. The watch was checked again. Same angle, same motion. As if time might have changed out of politeness. No one asked what they were waiting for. The question would have made it real, would have pinned it down. Instead, there were small noises that pretended they had their own reasons. A pen cap clicked on, clicked off, clicked on. A match was struck and held without lighting anything, then blown out with a thin, controlled breath. A shoe tapped the floor once, paused, then once again. In the air, there was that delicate sensation of something held back. Not panic, not yet. Something more restrained, like the room itself had learned to be careful. A cup was moved an inch to the left. A chair was pulled in, then pushed out, then left exactly where it had started. Someone cleared their throat and seemed surprised by how loud it sounded. The clock kept doing its work. The second hand passed the top and flashed. Flash, flash, flash. A hand reached for the pencil again, lifted it, pressed its tip lightly to paper. A pause. Nothing written. The pencil was set down. The hand stayed there, palm hovering over the page like it could hold the ink inside the wood. Outside, if there was an outside, something metallic groaned and settled. A distant engine coughed once and went quiet, the kind of sound that didn't mean anything on its own, but changed the way everyone listened afterward. A breath was taken in, held, let out. The latch clicked again, slower this time, as if the metal itself was trying to be gentle. Someone stood, not fully committing to standing, and then sat back down. The page on the table lifted at the corner again and fell. The air moved through in another pulse. The smell of oil and damp paper deepened, or maybe a tension made it feel deeper. The clock flashed at the top of its circle. Flash. And somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the small rituals, beyond the careful quiet, time kept walking forward, already too far along to be called back. There weren't many minutes left. A pale light sat on the edges of everything, neither day nor night, the color of ash before it cools. It came in through high windows dulled by grime and weather, breaking into soft rectangles on the floorboards. In those rectangles, dust moved slowly, like it had all the time in the world. The room was part of a larger structure. Long corridors, thick walls, doors that shut with a heavy finality. Somewhere nearby, a boiler ticked as it worked. Pipes warmed and cooled. The building made its own private noises, a slow old organism keeping itself alive. Outside, the air carried a muted weight. Distant motors, a low roll of something being dragged across gravel, the occasional flat report of metal striking metal. Nothing sharp enough to be called alarm. Just the sound of a place that had learned to live with strain. On the table, the papers were stamped and re-stamped, their corners softened by handling. Names and numbers sat in columns. Lines were underlined twice. A signature had been practiced in the margin, then crossed out. Someone had folded a map and unfolded it again so many times the creases had become permanent, like scars that refused to heal. Two men stood near the window. Their shoulders were hunched not from cold, but from habit. One held his cap in his hands and kneaded it gently, as if it were something that could be fixed through pressure alone. The other watched the courtyard below with an expression that tried to be neutral, and failed. In that courtyard, trucks were parked in a neat row. Their canvas backs were tied down, their tires streaked with old mud. A few soldiers moved among them, not rushing, not idling, working with the steady pace of people who had been told exactly what to do and had stopped asking why. Crates were lifted and set down. Ropes were checked, then checked again. A man with a clipboard pointed, and another man nodded without looking up. A routine, built on repetition. In a side room, a radio set hummed faintly. Its operator sat close, headphones pressed tight, fingers resting lightly on the knobs. Every so often he shifted his weight, and the chair gave a small complaint. His eyes were red at the edges, not from tears, but from too many hours of listening to static and half words. He wrote down fragments as they came because that was the job. Make the invisible audible. Make the distant present. Translate noise into meaning. The message board on the wall held pinned slips of paper, each one placed with care. Some were fresh and bright. Others had yellowed and curled. Dates were written in ink that had begun to fade. The board was crowded, but there were gaps left open deliberately, as if someone expected more to arrive and wanted to make room for it. A clock hung above it, its face smudged where fingers had touched it absent-mindedly. The second hand moved with unhurried confidence. It did not care what anyone in the building wanted. Somebody poured coffee from a dented pot into chipped cups. The smell was bitter and familiar. It had become, over months and years, the closest thing to comfort. A cup was offered. A head shook no. The cup was offered again, and this time it was accepted, more out of politeness than thirst. A young messenger entered and stopped just inside the doorway, as if uncertain whether he was allowed to bring movement into such stillness. His uniform hung a little loose. His boots were polished, but the polish couldn't hide the scuffs. He held an envelope in one hand and kept glancing at the clock like it might tell him how to behave. "No answer yet?" someone asked, not looking at him. "Not yet," the messenger said. His voice was careful. He stepped forward and placed the envelope on the table as though it might explode if dropped. The envelope sat among the other papers like a small, sealed mouth. No one opened it right away. It was not fear exactly. It was something close to superstition. The feeling that unopened things could still be harmless. A pencil was picked up. Notes were made in the margins. A list was rewritten, even though the original list was legible. A man with a thin face and tired eyes rubbed his thumb across the edge of a paper until it frayed. He was the kind of person who had learned to make his body smaller when senior voices entered a room. He did it now without thinking, even though no one important had arrived yet. Someone joked quietly about the weather. The words landed and disappeared. There was a polite exhale, almost laughter, but no one met anyone else's eyes. Humor had become a tool, used less to lighten things than to prove the mouth could still form ordinary shapes. Beyond the windows, a flag moved sluggishly on its pole, heavy in the damp air. It did not snap or wave. It simply shifted, as if tired. In another corridor, a clerk walked with a stack of folders held tight against his chest. He moved quickly, but not fast enough to suggest urgency. His pace said, "I have somewhere to be, but I am not allowed to run." He passed two soldiers leaning against a wall, smoking. They spoke in low voices about food, about a letter that hadn't arrived, about a friend they hoped had been reassigned somewhere safer. Their words stayed close to small things, because small things were still manageable. A telephone sat on a desk with its receiver cradled neatly. It looked innocent, even elegant. No one touched it. It was like the envelope, a quiet object that could change the air the moment it was engaged. A woman entered with more papers and set them down. Her hair was pinned back tightly. Her expression held that practiced neutrality of someone who had learned to keep all emotion behind the eyes. She nodded to no one in particular, then took a seat in the corner and began copying numbers from one sheet to another. The pen moved steadily. Scratch, scratch. Scratch, scratch. The same sound again and again, the sound of time being filled with tasks. Outside, a vehicle started. The engine turned over, coughed, then found its rhythm. It idled for a long moment. No one looked up. Engines started every day. Engines idled every day. Today, it was just another engine. But the sound threaded through the room anyway, weaving itself into every pause. A man at the window leaned closer and tried to see something beyond the courtyard, something past the buildings, past the fence, where the horizon was pale and indistinct. He couldn't see far. Fog or smoke blurred the distance, making it impossible to tell where the world ended and the sky began. He watched anyway, because watching was better than imagining. Someone finally reached for the envelope. Fingers slid under its flap, hesitated, then pulled it open with a slow, deliberate care. A single sheet was removed, unfolded, smoothed flat. Eyes scanned it. The reader's expression didn't change much, but something in the posture did. A small tightening. A breath held a fraction too long. He placed the paper back down. "Well?" someone asked. "It's nothing new," the reader said. The words were chosen like stones placed carefully to keep a path from collapsing. Same as before. A few heads nodded, relieved in a way they did not allow themselves to show. Same as before meant they could keep doing what they were doing. Same as before meant the routine still fit. The radio operator shifted, listened harder. Static whispered. Somewhere in the noise, a voice began to form and then vanished again, swallowed by distance. He wrote down what he thought he heard, then crossed it out, then wrote it again. In the courtyard, men continued tying ropes and checking straps. A crate was set down with a dull thud that sounded final for a moment, and then became just another sound. The clock's second hand passed the top and flashed in the window light. Flash. The building kept breathing. The people kept working. Words stayed small. Movements stayed measured. The day held itself together with thin, stubborn threads. And still, beneath all of it, there was that sensation, quiet, persistent, that the margin for delay was shrinking, minute by minute, whether anyone admitted it or not. The first thing to change was the rhythm, though no one could have said exactly when it happened. Movements were still calm, still practiced, but they began to lose their perfect symmetry. A crate was lifted and set down twice before it landed where it was meant to. A rope was tied, untied, then tied again with a knot just slightly different from the one before. Small corrections layered themselves over routine like thin cracks in glass, visible only if you were already looking for them. In the radio room, the static thickened. It didn't grow louder, it grew denser, as if more space were being filled with less clarity. The operator leaned forward until his forehead nearly touched the metal casing. His fingers hovered, ready to adjust, then pulled back. He had learned that too much interference could erase what little signal there was. So he listened instead, jaw tight, eyes half closed, waiting for meaning to separate itself from noise. A fragment came through. A call sign. Incomplete. A number that might have been a coordinate, or might have been nothing. He wrote it down anyway. He always did. The paper beside him filled with half-certainties and crossed-out guesses, a quiet record of things that almost mattered. In the main room, someone noticed that the clock had stopped ticking for a second. Just a second, maybe less, and then resumed, as if nothing had happened. No one mentioned it. Clocks were old. Clocks did that. Still, a man glanced up at it twice in quick succession, checking that the second hand was moving. It was. Near the window, the courtyard looked the same as it had an hour earlier, and that sameness was beginning to feel wrong. Trucks idled longer than expected. Men stood with hands on hips, waiting for instructions that had already been given. A clipboard was consulted, then consulted again. The list had not changed, but the checking continued, as if repetition alone could guarantee accuracy. One soldier paused mid-step and turned his head, listening. "Did you hear that?" he asked the man beside him. "Hear what?" The soldier hesitated, embarrassed by his own uncertainty. "Nothing," he said finally, and kept walking. But he adjusted the strap on his shoulder more tightly than before. Inside, papers were being moved from one side of the table to the other, then back again. A new stack appeared, thin but deliberate, placed carefully beside the older ones. The top page bore a stamp that hadn't been there earlier. Its ink was darker, fresher, still slightly raised to the touch. Someone traced the edge of that stamp with a fingertip, not consciously, just following the shape. The finger stopped, pulled away, and folded into the palm. A conversation began about supplies. It was ordinary, technical, almost soothing in its familiarity. Numbers were exchanged, units were confirmed. A discrepancy was noted, then explained away as a clerical delay. The explanation was accepted without argument. Everyone had learned which questions slowed things down without improving them. Down the corridor, a door that was usually locked stood ajar. A clerk noticed it, paused, then pushed it shut. The latch slid into place with a sound that was a little too sharp. He winced at the noise, then glanced around to see if anyone had noticed. No one had. The smell in the building shifted. It was subtle. Less paper, more oil, a hint of something metallic underneath. Someone opened a window a few inches. The pale air came in reluctantly, heavy with damp and distant smoke. It didn't feel cleaner. The window was closed again. In the radio room, the operator finally adjusted a knob. The static thinned, then surged. A voice broke through, distorted, stretched, as if coming from very far away or very deep. Words arrived out of order. A place name that didn't quite land. A request that ended mid-sentence. The operator straightened. He pressed the headphones tighter, his breathing shallow. "Repeat," he said into the microphone, careful to keep his voice level. "Repeat your last." Nothing answered him. The static returned to its steady whisper, indifferent. He wrote down what he thought he'd heard and underlined it once. Then, after a pause, he underlined it again. In the main room, a man stood and walked to the map. He studied it with more intensity than the moment required, finger hovering just above a cluster of markings. He did not touch the paper. Touching it felt like commitment. Instead, he nodded to himself and stepped back, as if the map had told him what he needed to know. A telephone rang in another office, far enough away to sound muted. It rang once, twice, then stopped. No one moved to answer it. Someone said, "They'll call back," with an assurance that felt rehearsed. Coffee had gone cold in its cups. One was lifted, sipped, and grimaced at. The cup was set down unfinished. No one bothered to replace it. Outside, the engine that had been idling finally shut off. The sudden quiet drew several glances toward the window. For a moment, the absence of sound felt heavier than the noise had. Then another engine started somewhere farther off, restoring the familiar background hum. A runner arrived with a message and left almost immediately. The paper he delivered was added to the stack without comment. It was read later, not right away. There was no rush, not officially. A man laughed softly at something said under his breath, then stopped himself when he realized he was alone in the reaction. The laugh turned into a cough. He cleared his throat and busied his hands with a folder. The clock continued its work, but the flashes of light at the top of each rotation seemed closer together now, as if the eye were growing impatient. Flash. Flash. In the radio room, another fragment came through, clearer this time but shorter. A warning, perhaps, or a status update. The operator wasn't sure. He stood, pushing his chair back too quickly. The chair scraped the floor. The sound carried into the corridor. Someone looked up. "Did you get something?" "Maybe," the operator said. He held up the paper, then hesitated. "It's not complete." "Then wait," came the reply. Not unkind, just firm. We'll see if it fills in. The operator sat back down, though his posture stayed rigid, like he might spring up again at any moment. In the courtyard, a crate slipped from someone's grip and dropped a few inches before being caught. The sound was sharp, wrong. Heads turned. A brief, uncomfortable pause followed. "You've got it," someone said, forcing a lightness that didn't quite land. The crate was set down properly, work resumed. No harm done, no reason to stop. Inside, the stamped paper was moved to the top of its stack. No one announced the change. It simply happened, the way small decisions often do, quietly and without ceremony. A pencil broke when someone pressed too hard. The snap was quick and final. The broken pieces were gathered, placed neatly in a drawer, and forgotten. Static whispered. Engines hummed. Pens scratched. Boots shifted on stone. All the small sounds of a functioning system continued to layer themselves over the growing sense that something was misaligned. No alarm sounded. No orders changed. No one raised their voice. But the signs were there, scattered through the ordinary. Misheard words, stalled engines, unfinished messages, collecting patiently, waiting for someone to see them for what they were. No one did. Not yet. The interval narrowed without anyone naming it. Clocks still marked time in full minutes, but the space between them felt thinner, stretched tight. Movements became slightly more deliberate, as if each action were being weighed before execution, not out of fear, but out of a growing need to avoid unnecessary motion. A decision sat unfinished on a desk. It wasn't written as a decision. It was framed as a confirmation, a procedural follow-up, something that required no debate. The paper waited beside a pen, its margin already bearing faint indentations where someone had pressed too hard while thinking. The pen was lifted once, then set back down with care, aligned parallel to the edge of the desk. "Later," someone said quietly, not to anyone in particular. No one disagreed. In the corridor, a messenger paused, uncertain whether to enter or turn back. He checked the time on his watch, then checked it again, as if expecting the hands to offer guidance. They did not. After a moment, he leaned against the wall and waited. Waiting had become the default posture. The radio operator sat very still now. The static had smoothed into a low, consistent hiss, almost comforting. He removed one side of his headphones briefly, listening to the room itself. Footsteps, murmured voices, the soft drag of a chair leg, then replaced it, returning to the signal. Nothing new arrived. The absence began to feel deliberate. Outside, preparations slowed in subtle ways. Men stood with equipment already secured, hands idle, glancing toward supervisors who were themselves occupied with clipboards that no longer changed. A truck remained parked with its engine off, keys still in the ignition. No one claimed it. No one reassigned it. A senior officer walked through the courtyard, nodding as he passed. He asked if everything was in order. "Yes," came the reply. It was immediate, automatic. He accepted it and moved on. Inside, a map was adjusted on the wall. One corner had begun to curl away from its pin. Someone smoothed it flat and added a second tack, careful not to tear the paper. The map held, but the new pin cast a small shadow that hadn't been there before. A conversation unfolded near the window, low, restrained. It circled around timing, around alignment, around whether conditions were optimal. No one said now or not yet. The language stayed conditional, hypothetical, safely incomplete. "We still have a window," one voice said. "How wide?" another asked. There was a pause. Not long enough to be suspicious, just long enough to suggest calculation. "Enough," came the answer. The word settled uneasily. A telephone rang once in an adjoining office and stopped. This time someone did stand. He took 2 steps toward the doorway, then halted as if reconsidering. The phone did not ring again. He returned to his seat and folded his hands together, interlacing his fingers tightly. In the records room, a clerk discovered that 2 timestamps did not align. The discrepancy was small, minutes, not hours. He recalculated, then recalculated again. The difference remained. He marked it with a faint symbol in the margin and placed the file at the end of the stack instead of the middle. It would be addressed later, he told himself. There was always later. The light outside shifted, barely perceptible, but enough to change the color of the floor near the windows. Dust continued to float slower now, as if suspended. Someone noticed it and wondered briefly how long it took a single particle to fall from ceiling height to the ground. No one answered. The question dissolved. A runner arrived with another message, breath steady, posture correct. The message was acknowledged with a nod and placed beside the others. It joined the growing pile of confirmations, updates, and clarifications. None of them urgent on their own. All of them connected by something unspoken. A man cleared his throat, preparing to speak, then stopped. He adjusted his jacket instead, smoothing a crease that had already been smooth. In the radio room, the operator leaned forward again. His hand hovered over the transmit switch. He did not press it. Procedure dictated waiting for a full transmission, a complete thought. What he had were fragments. Fragments did not justify interruption. He wrote the time in his log anyway. Outside, the far fence line blurred as the air thickened. Whatever lay beyond it remained indistinct, unreachable by sight. A soldier stared at it longer than necessary, then looked away, unsettled by the feeling that something was approaching without moving. Inside, the unfinished paper on the desk was finally turned face down. That small act, quiet, administrative, closed a space that had briefly existed. Not permanently, just enough. No alarm sounded, no orders were given. Nothing irreversible had occurred. But the window everyone believed they still had was no longer as open as it seemed, and no one in the room could say exactly when it began to close. Something shifted without drawing attention to itself. It was not announced. It did not interrupt anyone mid-sentence. It did not arrive with sound. It occurred the way small administrative acts often do, quietly, as part of a sequence that already felt decided. In the records room, the clerk returned to the file he had set aside earlier. He did not do it with urgency. He did it because the stack beside him had grown uneven, and uneven stacks had a way of nagging at the mind. He took the file, flipped it open, and compared two entries one last time. The discrepancy was still there. It always would be. He reached for the pencil, hesitated, then used ink instead. The change was minor. A line corrected, a figure aligned, a time brought into agreement with the rest of the page. When he finished, he blotted the ink carefully and closed the file. The folder slid back into the middle of the stack, no longer marked for review. The system on paper was now consistent. Down the corridor, a door was closed that normally remained open during preparation. No instruction required it. No sign requested it. The person who closed it did so out of habit, tidying a space that felt unfinished. The latch engaged fully. The hallway beyond fell quiet. In the courtyard, the unattended truck was claimed. A soldier climbed into the cab, checked the ignition, and started the engine. He had been told earlier to wait, but the waiting had grown vague, unanchored to any clear signal. The engine caught immediately this time. He let it idle, satisfied, and began checking gauges. No one stopped him. Inside, the face-down paper on the desk was lifted again. Not to read, but to move aside. It was placed beneath a ledger, disappearing from view. The pen that had rested beside it was returned to its holder. The empty space where both had been gave the desk a sense of completion. "That's done," someone said quietly, referring to something else entirely. The words lingered longer than they should have. In the radio room, the operator finally removed his headphones. The static had thinned to almost nothing. He marked the time of signal loss, labeled it as a temporary drop, and signed his initials at the bottom of the page. The action felt formal, final. He stretched his neck and stood, allowing himself a moment away from the equipment. He did not hear the brief burst that followed his departure. It came and went in less than a second. Too short to record, too incomplete to interpret. The machine returned to silence as if nothing had passed through it. Outside, men began to mount vehicles not because they were told to, but because there was nothing left to prepare. Straps were tightened for the last time. A helmet was adjusted. A glove pulled snug. Each gesture closed a loop that had been open earlier. A senior officer walked the length of the courtyard again. He observed without correcting. Everything appeared aligned. That was enough. Near the window, a man watched the flag stir slightly, then settle. He checked his watch and found the time acceptable. He did not consider whether acceptable meant correct. In the corridor, the messenger who had waited earlier was dismissed with a nod. He turned and left the building at a brisk walk, relieved to have movement again. He did not look back. Inside, a final stamp was pressed onto a document. The ink was dark, deliberate. The stamp lifted, leaving behind a mark that could not be erased without notice. The document joined the others, indistinguishable now, except for that single impression. No one spoke when it happened. There was no collective realization, no intake of breath shared across the room. Conversations resumed at their previous volume. Chairs scraped, pages turned. The ordinary sounds continued uninterrupted, but the margin had vanished. The small adjustments, the quiet closures, the corrections made for the sake of order, had accumulated into something solid, something directional. What remained was no longer a situation under review, but a sequence already in motion. Nothing dramatic had occurred. Nothing irreversible had been announced. Yet every path that could have bent away had been gently, efficiently straightened. And somewhere within the machinery of routine, a line had been crossed so softly that no one noticed it disappear. The room settled into a stillness that felt earned, not imposed, not forced, simply arrived at, like dust after motion has ceased. Chairs were occupied again, but no one adjusted them now. Papers lay where they had been left, no longer squared or reordered. Pens rested with their tips turned away from the page, drying. The work that could be done had been done. What remained did not belong to hands. Breathing slowed, not deliberately, just naturally, as if the body understood that any excess movement would be wasted. In the radio room, the equipment hummed at its lowest register. Lights glowed steadily, unchanged. The empty chair faced the console, waiting for its occupant to return, though it would not be needed again in quite the same way. The headphones lay coiled neatly, their padding still warm. A clock ticked. The sound was no longer sharp. It blended into the air, indistinguishable from the building's own pulse. Each second passed cleanly into the next, without resistance, without pause. Outside, engines idled in a loose formation. No revving, no acceleration, just the steady vibration of readiness. Exhaust drifted low and pale, hanging close to the ground before dispersing. Boots rested on pedals. Hands held steering wheels lightly, as if gripping too tightly might be premature. Someone adjusted a mirror and then left it alone. A voice spoke somewhere down the corridor. Quiet, factual, unremarkable. It ended without emphasis. There was no response. None was required. The light beyond the windows had thinned. It flattened against the glass, losing its earlier definition. The dust that had floated so patiently now seemed suspended, neither falling nor rising, caught between decisions already made. A man at the window closed his eyes briefly. Not in prayer, not in dread, just a momentary withdrawal from watching. When he opened them again, nothing had changed. Inside the records room, files rested in their proper places. Ledgers were closed, margins were clean. The ink had dried completely, binding words to paper with quiet permanence. In the courtyard, a signal passed from one person to another without gesture or sound. It was understood. Movements followed it instinctively. Doors were shut. Engines shifted pitch. One by one, vehicles rolled forward a fraction of a meter and stopped again. The pause stretched. It was not suspenseful. It was complete. There was no longer a sense of delay, only of alignment. Everything sat exactly where it needed to be to continue. Nothing more, nothing less. The radio remained silent. The telephone did not ring. No new messages arrived. Time moved unchallenged. A final glance was taken at a watch. The hand rested precisely where it was expected to rest. The man wearing it did not check again. Somewhere far beyond the walls, beyond sight and signal, the unseen continued its approach, not rushing, not hesitating, following the course that had been cleared for it. Inside, no one spoke. No one moved. The quiet did not feel temporary anymore. It felt like the last breath held before sound returns, and then stops forever.